Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Mona Simion. She is professor of philosophy and director of the COGITO Epistemology Research Centre at the University of Glasgow. And today we're talking about her book, Resistance to Evidence. So, Dr. Simion, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, let's start perhaps with a basic question here. So could you start by telling us what resistance to evidence is, what it means, and as a philosopher, why do you think we need a philosophical account of this sort of phenomenon?
Yeah, so I think that what's important to note when you look in the landscape of people resisting scientific evidence is that epistemologically, it's a very complicated landscape. So it's not the case that everybody who resists scientific evidence is crazy, I guess is what I'll say. Some people, of course, are doing it for no good reason. Some people are doing it for bad reasons, like, from motivated reasoning. They just don't like to believe that stuff, so then they don't. But some people, as a matter of fact, are in a much more complicated evidential situation where they find themselves not knowing exactly what to believe because they get contrary evidence from different sources. So depending on your kind of evidential environment, what evidence you have available to you, what your environment tells you is the case, and so on, it may well be that your rejection of scientific evidence is not irrational evidence resistance. But this is a distinction that is very often not made in in mass media, for instance, but also not in research. So, for instance, in social psychology, the assumption has always been that there's got to be some source of irrationality that explains this phenomenon. So that's why I think a careful epistemological investigation that is able to draw the relevant distinctions between rational and irrational rejection of evidence is important. The way I use this terminology in the book in order to to make the distinction clear, I call evidence resistance irrational resistance to evidence. And I call cases in which you reject evidence for good reasons just evidence rejections, in order to signal that these two are very different phenomena.
But again, the second part of my question that I don't think you addressed directly, why do we need the philosophical account of it? I mean, we could just go with, for example, a psychological account or something like that.
Social psychological accounts are descriptive accounts. So this kind of important epistemological distinctions are normative distinctions, right? So psychology doesn't know how to do normativity. That's the kind of thing that philosophers know how to do. So what they know how to do is to describe what they see on the ground. What they struggle to do is to see the normative distinctions between two phenomena that look exactly the same descriptively, but are normatively different. So the example that I was giving you was with evidence, irrational versus rational evidence rejection, right? So that is a distinction that is normative. Rationality is a normative phenomena. If you just look at what people do on the ground, you're not going to be able, as a psychologist, to know whether what they're doing is rational or irrational. And this is exactly what we see when we look at social psychological studies of this phenomenon. So just to give you one example, the most kind of popular or at least hot hypothesis in social psychology is that this phenomenon is vastly generated by politically motivated reasoning, that people reject scientific evidence when it suits them because to do so because it doesn't fit nicely with their political identity. So, if you're a far-right person and part of your political identity is to reject that climate change is happening, but to accept that guns are safe, no matter what evidence you bring, the thought is these people are going to reject it because of motivated reasoning. But if you look carefully at the experimental setup, you notice that actually the claim is not supported by the data on the ground, in that in these people that are tested, they do have the relevant political identity, but that is also correlated with reasons, with a vast amount of evidence that suggest background evidence that supports the relevant claim, right? So one example is if you grew up in in an American state where you've been told since you were small that all kinds of reasons to believe that guns are important for your safety, you're going to have a lot of testimonial evidence that guns are safe. In a way in which me in Glasgow, I'm not going to have any of that, right? So basically, the way in which we're going to deal with evidence having to do with gun safety is going to be rationally so very different because we have different background evidence. And this is the kind of stuff that social psychologists cannot capture in their experimental setting without collaborating with an epistemologist who understands the difference between the two types of evidential settings, basically.
So in regards to this type of phenomenon, I've had on the show people like Hugo Mercier and then Sperber, and they do work on a phenomenon that they call epistemic vigilance. Does that relate in any way to resistance to evidence or not?
Yeah, so in the book, I consider whether that might be one way to explain what's going on. So here is how that might explain it. So what Mercier calls epistemic and Sperber call epistemic vigilance, is basically this property that they stipulate we have, and they think the fact that that this stipulation is plausible is supported by all kinds of phenomena. Whereby we are good at filtering, they think, bad from good testifiers, for instance, so that we have this kind of mechanism that kind of filter for defeaters, as it were, so for evidence that our testifier is not trustworthy, right? And they think that that's what explains, in a way, our success as a species, because of course we rely a lot on each other's testimony for the knowledge that we have. So their hypothesis is that, if we didn't have this vigilance mechanism, it is a mystery how we would have succeeded as a species, given how much we need to rely on each other. So if you think this faculty of epistemic vigilance exists, one way that you might try to explain what's going on is to say, well, look, our cognitive capacities have evolved in a very different information environment than the one that we inhabit right now, right? So they aren't evolved to deal with this kind of high density, high choice information environment that we are now inhabiting because of the internet, right? Because of that, they might be malfunctioning, which is to be expected, for any functional item that is moved out of its normal conditions into abnormal conditions. So you might think, well, we have this mechanisms for epistemic vigilance, but those are working quite well in a normal environment where our testifiers are like, people that we meet in person, and we can read maybe signs of deception on their face. And we know whom to trust and whom not to trust because they have a particular social profile that we're aware of. So it's much easier, as it were, to be vigilant if your testifiers are all kind of flesh and blood people that you meet in the street, that you know about from your neighbors and so on. It's much harder to be vigilant online where everything is more or less anonymous, right? Yeah. And the amount of information coming at you is also hard to process, right? So it's much easier to process one or two testifiers every minute as you walk down the street than the amount of stuff that comes at you on the internet. So maybe what's going on is that people don't know what to believe anymore. So this kind of epistemic vigilance faculties are misfiring, right? So they're making you skeptic when you shouldn't be, because they just don't know how to fire well anymore, since they haven't evolved to deal with this kind of craziness. So that's one explanation that you can give. The worry that I have, I have two worries for this explanation. One is that, again, it stipulates that that everybody who does it is malfunctioning. Everybody who rejects scientific evidence is malfunctioning, right? And that implies some widespread irrationality assumption, which is very implausible. We are a very successful species. So to think, given how well we're doing in the world, to think that our cognitive mechanisms are failing in this way on such a large scale would be very surprising, right? Given how much epistemic resource we need in order to be so successful, right? But the more important problem is that a lot of psychological studies suggest that actually we're very bad at what they call vigilance. That even in normal settings with our, friends and neighbors, we are extremely bad at detecting deception. Indeed, we are basically just a bit above average. So it's a coin toss whether we detect deception or not. So we think of ourselves as being much better at detecting when someone is lying or not, and so on, than we actually are, as it turns out. Is that always true? No, we are much better at detecting deception in contexts where we have a lot of information. So when we know this person really well, maybe finally we start getting used to the ways in which they behave when they lie, or when we have all kinds of other contextual information, like, we know that there's something fishy about this person. We know that whatever they say doesn't fit with whatever this other person says. So then we are good at detecting deception, but that is to be expected, of course, because that again is explained by the background evidence that we have. So basically, given these two worries, I'm thinking that the explanation in terms of our vigilance mechanisms failing, I think, is not likely to be the best explanation of the data.
So just to ask you briefly about the kind of approach that you bring into your book when it comes to resistance to evidence. At a certain point, you say that you approach it through positive epistemology instead of negative epistemology. What does that mean exactly?
So it's a term that I borrow, and I'm grateful for, from Jonathan Jenkins Ichikawa. So the tradition in epistemology for 2000 years is very surprising to me when you think about it, has been very much focused on epistemic permissions rather than epistemic obligations, which is not the case in other normative fields, right? In morality, for instance, we care a lot about obligations, right? So that's very strange that we would have a normative field where we don't discuss obligation, we only discuss permission for 2000 years. And you might wonder why that's the case. So here's what happened. People throughout history of epistemology, very clever people, assumed that believing is risky. So, forming a belief is like jumping, right? So like you're taking a risk. And then they kept asking the question, when is it safe enough to take the jump, as it were? When do you have enough evidence? When are you justified enough to take this jump into believing? And you can see why people might think in this way prima facie, because you might think, well, as soon as you believe, you do a lot of stuff with that belief, right? You start asserting it, you start acting on it. So that's why you should be really careful before you jump, before you form the belief. So this kind of assumption led people to focus on when belief is permissible, but not on when belief might be obligatory given your evidential situation. So in that sense, it's been a 2000 years history of negative epistemology, in that people have debated what restrictions we should put on our believing, right, on our forming beliefs. How should we restrict it better, such that when we finally jump, it's safe to jump, as it were. I think that the most recent phenomena having to do with evidence rejection pointed out to us that we were wrong, that to only focus on problems arising from jumping too quick, as it were. There are also problems arising for not jumping when you can jump, right? And that's exactly what phenomena like vaccine skepticism and climate change skepticism has shown to us, that sometimes you should form your belief and go ahead and act, go ahead and get the vaccine, because you might die if you don't. So not forming the belief is hardly the safe option. It's not safer epistemically, is not safer practically. Your health will not benefit for it. And the same with climate change denialism, right? So I think that very recent phenomena in the landscape have kind of shown us that it was a mistake all along to only focus on epistemic permissions rather than obligations. I also think that we have, what these phenomena have helped us theoreticians see is that this was completely unwarranted, this focus on negative epistemology to begin with, because when you don't form a belief, you form a suspension. Normally, that's what you do. You suspend belief, right? A suspension is also a doxastic attitude, just like belief. It's a different kind of doxastic attitude, but still a doxastic attitude. So the assumption that one particular doxastic attitude comes for free, that you that you don't need any evidence for it, that it doesn't need to be properly justified. That was, if you think about it, completely crazy all along. Of course, a suspension is going to be a good suspension, a permissible suspension, only if it fits your evidence properly, just like belief. So I guess it's one of those very interesting cases in which the real world has informed the theory and has made it better for it, I think.
So we're also going to talk a little bit about suspending judgments or suspending beliefs later on in our conversation. But just before that, I guess that there's also another important question to address here. So what is evidence? Particularly from a philosophical perspective, what are some of the most common accounts of evidence out there, and how do you suggest we should approach it?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So indeed, this project, this book was initially, it's an old project. It hasn't started quite yesterday. The project started in a way before the phenomenon of evidence resistance became such a well-known problem publicly. I was just trying to develop a better account of evidence. This was a project about evidence. That's all there was to it. And the reason why I was trying to develop a better account was because I wasn't satisfied with the accounts that were available on the market. So of course, people in philosophy disagree about everything. So there's not a lot of stuff that people agree on. But here is something that you find with very few exceptions throughout history of epistemology. When it comes to what it is for someone to have evidence, people tend to think that having of evidence relation refers to, in one way or another, the evidence being in your head. So that's what people believe in epistemology if you look throughout history, that it's either you have the evidence if, for instance, you believe it. So I have evidence that there's a computer in front of me because I believe that there's a computer in front of me, or because I'm justified I have a belief and it's justified, or because I know it. I have evidence that there's a computer in front of me because I know that there's a computer in front of me, and so on. So these are, some doxastic accounts, but you can also have an account that's not doxastic, doesn't imply belief, where your evidence are your seemings. So whatever hits my eye and generates a seeming as though of a laptop in me, that's my evidence that there's a laptop on the table. This is, it's not about having beliefs, but it's still in the head, right? So the assumption is always that as soon as you have the evidence, it's got to be that it lies somewhere within your skull, as it were, right? And that's an assumption, interestingly, that's shared by camps that are quite opposite on all other fronts in epistemology. Internalists, externalists share this assumption for the most part. Now, here's what I found very strange about this assumption. It doesn't fit at all with our folk conception of having evidence. So if I talk to my grandmother tomorrow and she said something like, well, why didn't you buy any carrots at the market as I asked you to? And I said, well, I didn't have any evidence that there were carrots at the market. And she would go like, didn't you see the carrots on the table at the market? Well, no, because, I just couldn't believe my eyes that there were carrots at the market. So since evidence is belief, I didn't have any evidence that there were carrots at the market. So I don't think my grandma would be very, very, satisfied with this explanation. And now leaving my grandma's side, it looks like even in legal context, we don't use evidence in that way, right? So now imagine a detective who's taking testimony on the stand, and the judge asked them, did you have evidence that the butler killed the victim? And the detective said, no, I didn't have any. Well, how do you mean? Didn't you go to the crime scene? Didn't you see all the stuff that suggested that the butler did it? Well, I saw it, but I couldn't believe my eyes because the butler is such a good friend of mine, and I couldn't believe my eyes that he would do such a thing. Again, I don't think that testimony would be acceptable in court. So it does look as though, for instance, accounts that take having evidence to have to do something with believing it depart quite abruptly from the folk conception, right? And when it comes to seemings, the problem doesn't disappear either. So we know, for instance, that our seemings tend to be penetrated by all kinds of biases. So we perceive black faces as being more dangerous than white faces, for instance. So we get those kind of seemings that are only sourced in our bias. They're not justified in any way. So one result that we don't want is to say that as soon as you're biased, you have evidence that black people are more dangerous than white people, because that's clearly not the result that you want, right? You need to go back to the drawing board if that's the result that your theory gets. So because of this dissatisfaction that I had with extant accounts of evidence, I thought, look, we need an account that doesn't place having evidence in your head. Clearly, having evidence doesn't have to be that you have the evidence in your head. It's just something having to do with availability, right? If it's very readily available to you, you have it. If it's lying on the table in front of you, you have evidence, right? Whether you choose to disbelieve it or not is completely irrelevant. So those are kind of the accounts that exist in the literature very roughly, and that's what motivated me to put together a new account that is based on this notion of being in a position to know. You don't need to know these facts in order for them to count as part of your evidence. You just need to be in a position to know them, in a position to basically take them up in your cognitive system.
And earlier in my very first question, I asked you, why do we need a philosophical account of resistance to evidence? You mentioned that science, psychology more specifically, doesn't deal, at least directly, with the normative aspects of this sort of phenomenon. But what normative aspects of resistance to evidence do you consider? And what sort of normativity are we talking about here exactly? Is it social normativity, moral normativity, or some other sort of normativity?
Yeah, good. So one thing that people have thought for a long time is something along these lines. Look, when it comes to forming beliefs, we don't have obligations to form them because we don't have control over our belief formation. They just happen automatically to us. As soon as I see this laptop, I believe it's there, whether I want it or not. And people for the longest time, mistakenly in philosophy, thought that an unrestricted version of the following principle is true. Ought implies can. You cannot have an obligation if you can't do it. And this sounds plausible at first. It's a principle notably put forth by Kant, but recent results in ethics suggest strongly that it's a false principle. And if we want there's something true to it, but it needs to be restricted, right? For instance, just because I can't treat women and black people well because I'm a racist and a sexist, it doesn't follow that it's not the case that I ought to treat them well, right? So clearly the principle is false. But because people believe this principle and assumed it, they thought there is no way there can be oughts to believe something. So then how do we explain this resistance to evidence and what's wrong with it? People thought, well, it has to do with the breach of some other type of normativity. Maybe it's a breach of social normativity. So it can't be epistemic normativity that's breached. It's got to be social or moral normativity. So accounts in the literature, for instance, try to suggest that what is going on is that we inhabit a particular social role. And because we inhabit the social roles come with social obligations that sometimes are social epistemic obligations because, we all depend on each other for information and we can't really cooperate with each other unless we do this kind of information exchange well. But in order to do this information exchange well, it better be the case that we, privately, as it were, also do our information uptake well, because otherwise we're not going to participate in this exchange in a valuable fashion. So the thought was, well, look, this resistance to evidence is not epistemically problematic, but it is socially problematic because you're going to, as it were, mess up with the entire epistemic landscape when you don't take up the evidence that you can and put them in the common, as it were, basket of epistemic resource. So that was one explanation that was offered. Another explanation that was offered, look, is just a moral problem. In this case, so say the case that I gave earlier, where you have all the evidence in the world that this black person in front of you is smiling and is being very kind, but because you're a racist, you have this impression that they look angry. So some epistemologists thought, look, as soon as your seeming is in that way, you're justified to believe that they're angry, but so epistemically that you're doing nothing wrong, but morally, of course, is bad because the reason why you have this seeming is because you're a biased racist person and being a racist is bad. So why, you might think, why don't these two explanations suffice? Why do we need to make it epistemic, the problem, like my account does it? Very quickly about the social explanation, the reason why it doesn't work is because if you want to say that the only thing that's wrong with this is social, the problem is that some social norms are bad. Not all social norms are good. To the contrary, most of them are bad. So one thing that you don't want to say is that as soon as a social norm says something like don't believe women, that makes it okay not to believe women, right? So resistance to evidence from women is socially okay. If it's also epistemic, you okay, what's the problem? You know what I mean? So that's the social problem, as it were. The problem with the moral explanation is even worse. So first of all, because you can easily cook up cases where it's morally actually good or even required to resist this evidence. So I have a case in my book uh, of basically partiality in friendship. So many people in ethics think that we owe to our friends to be a bit more skeptical about accepting evidence for their wrongdoing, as it were. So if someone comes and tells me that my friend just killed someone in the street, I should be skeptical, right? No, my friend didn't do such a thing. Well, if they just come and say the same thing about a stranger, I should just say, okay. So if that's true that we have a moral obligation to our friends to be a bit more skeptical when it comes to this kind of stuff, then it would look as though there are cases when resistance to evidence is morally good, but you still want to say that it's epistemically problematic, right? So remember the case of the detective that we were talking about earlier. If the detective comes and says, I didn't believe any evidence that the butler did it because the butler is a friend of mine and I can't believe these things about my friends, that's not a good thing epistemically, right? So that's one very serious problem. Another problem is that we know from a long history of ethics that moral responsibility has an epistemic condition on it. So if you are to be, for instance, blameworthy, it better be the case that you meet some sort of epistemic condition. Otherwise, you're going to be blamelessly ignorant, right? So if you did everything in your power to investigate a particular topic and you still ended up with a false belief, you're not going to be morally responsible either because you did your job well. But of course, if there is an epistemic condition of moral responsibility, and we want to claim that it is about moral responsibility, what this resistance to evidence is, why it's problematic, then we're just, getting back to the same problem because moral responsibility implies an epistemic condition. So we still need to answer the question, okay, what's epistemically wrong, as it were? So that's why these two ways of explaining the data are not going to work.
So let's talk now a little bit about suspended judgment. That is something that you touched on a little bit earlier. And you mentioned the examples of climate change and vaccination, where, I mean, they are two situations where perhaps people shouldn't suspend their judgment very much because it has very direct consequences to their health and now to our economy, environment, and so on. So, are there situations where you think that it is or it would be epistemically permissible for us to suspend our judgment? What would be your account of that?
So what I do in the book is I consider all kinds of ways of accounting for what it is for suspension of judgment to be permissible. And in particular, I distinguish between two things. First of all, there's one thing to suspend the judgment, and it's another thing to be completely neutral, which are sometimes people don't talk much about this distinction, and they don't make it clear what the view is about one or the other. So suspending judgment, is just something that you are permitted to do in cases in which you don't have enough evidence to support full belief, right? Go ahead and have an outright belief that something is the case. So if you don't have enough evidence for that, then you're fine to suspend judgment, where suspension of judgment just means not believing it. And so basically being in an attitude of not fully believing. It's a completely different story what neutrality is, where neutrality is being completely neutral of whether something is the case or not. So being at 50-50, as it were, right? And why do I say this, that this is very important? Well, because take the case of vaccine, right? So you would hear vaccine skeptics very often saying things like, look, there's a lot of evidence that vaccines are safe, but I've seen some people saying the contrary as well. So until I'm certain, I'm not going to take the vaccine because I want to be certain before I, put that thing in my body. Well, that's a mistake. So say that you are in an evidential environment where you have very many testifiers giving you misleading evidence against the safety of vaccine, right? And then if these testifiers have a good track record, you're right to trust them. You might be in a situation in which you don't have enough evidence available to you to fully believe that the vaccine is safe. Scientists are saying that they're safe, but then your family, who are otherwise people that you trust and you trust for a good reason, they're reliable and so on, they care about you, they say that there's something fishy about it, that the scientists are motivated by some industry funder and so on, right? So maybe you are in an evidential environment in which you don't have enough evidence for full belief. So then it's okay to suspend judgment. Here's what is not okay, is to be fully neutral, because that is only okay when your evidence is really 50-50. So you have exactly 0.5 on one hand and 0.5 on the other. And this matters because what we need for action is not full belief. What we need for action is just enough confidence given what, as it were, the value of the outcome is to us. So let's go back to vaccines. There's no option to do nothing. You either go and take the vaccine, or you decide not to take it and you remain vulnerable to the virus. There's no midway between these two, right? So what you need to do now is you look at the evidence for the vaccine safety that you have and say that is not enough for full belief. In your case, is not, I don't know, say that full belief is a threshold of 0.9 probability. Say that you are at 0.7, so you don't have enough for full belief. But, now think about it. So you have 0.7 probability that is going to be great, is going to be okay if you take the vaccine, right? How much probability do you have that you're going to be okay if you don't take the vaccine, right? Well, that's not great, right? There's a lot of people dying without the vaccine. So even in cases, I guess what I'm saying, in which suspended judgment is justified, neutrality is not justified, then if neutrality is not justified, you still should go and take that vaccine because you still have enough evidential support to act and go and take the vaccine. So that's why I draw this distinction and I discuss it in the chapter, because very often you see epistemologists focusing either on one or the other, depending on whether they are formal epistemologists or they're more traditional epistemologists. So I think that these two distinctions are very important to the topic.
So in the book, you also address at a certain point what you call their virtue responsibilist approaches to resistance to evidence. So what are these kinds of approaches and what do you think about them?
Yeah, so virtue responsibilism, you might think on the face of it, has fantastic resources to deal with the phenomenon, because what they care about are virtues and vices, basically epistemic virtues and vices. So things that are things like open-mindedness or curiosity are supposed to be virtues, and things like dogmatism are supposed to be vices. And the thought would be, well, this isn't resistance to evidence, clearly just a case of dogmatism, or a case in which this person is not open-minded enough. So isn't that the problem? It may well be that sometimes in these cases of evidence resistance, they are manifestations of these vices. It may well be that the person in question is a dogmatic person. And, you see this, for instance, in cases in which, so we know from science that cognitive flexibility, so in a way, our open-mindedness, as it were, decreases with age. So that is one explanation for why what you see is that people, as they become older, they become more entrenched in their opinions and harder to move out of their opinions. So you see that a lot. And, one explanation for that can be just epistemic. They gather so much evidence during a huge lifetime for their beliefs that it's harder to change now because it's harder to defeat that evidence. But another explanation, unfortunately, is that with age, we all get less cognitively flexible, so we're less open to other people's views. And you might think, well, that's exactly the phenomenon that we're looking for, right? This person is less open-minded and more dogmatic because they have this decrease in cognitive flexibility. So that's what's going on. Unfortunately, this phenomenon doesn't need to happen in people who are vicious. And indeed, again, stipulating that everybody who resists scientific evidence is a vicious cognizer is a bit much, because it's a very well spread phenomenon. And again, we are a highly successful species, which implies that we are actually quite good cognizers. So if viciousness would be so widely spread, we wouldn't be doing that well. In particular, what tends to happen a lot is that perfectly fine cognizers, perfectly virtuous cognizers, make mistakes on a particular topic, right? So let's go to the social psychological explanations in terms of motivated reasoning. It might be that you're a fantastic cognizer on all walks of life, But when it comes to things that affect your political identity, you just don't reason well anymore, right? You're going to believe all kinds of rubbish just because you want to preserve your political identity. But that doesn't mean that you're a vicious cognizer in general, because, these vices imply quite a lot of kind of disposition for failure. So you need to be quite bad to be, properly describable as vicious. And it can also just be a one-off failure, and we want to be able to explain that, a completely unmotivated one-off failure, this resistance to evidence. It might be that just one-off, I don't appreciate exactly the evidential situation properly. So we are pliable cognizers, but not infallible. So that just basically implies that we fail sometimes. And when we do that, on just one occasion, we still want to be able to explain what went wrong there and to predict that something did go wrong. But if our only resource is to say, well, it was a manifestation of vice, well, no manifestation. By stipulation, this is a perfectly fine cognizer. They just failed once. So that's why I think that although prima facie it might look like virtue responsibilist has fantastic resources to account for this phenomenon. To the contrary, it's gonna, the danger is that they're gonna predict too much viciousness in the population in order to be able to account for all the instances of this phenomenon.
So you also characterize in the book resistance to evidence as an instance of input level epistemic malfunctioning. Could you explain that terminology and particularly what malfunctioning means in this specific context?
Yeah, so what my book says is, look, we need to distinguish between evidence resistance and mere evidence rejection. Evidence rejection doesn't need to be evidence resistance. It can just be perfectly justified, right? If my evidential environment is such that it's populated with a lot of misleading evidence against the safety of vaccines, I am perfectly justified to reject the evidence of its safety. Is it true that it's not safe? No, of course it's not true, but we are, as a matter of fact, fallible cognizers, and very often we are misled by misleading evidence. And when that happens, we are responding properly to this evidence, because misleading evidence is evidence, right? So when we are being misled by it, it is a good reaction and a rational reaction to go with this misleading evidence. And we shouldn't try to change that, because that's the normal way to function epistemically, to respond to your evidence, because of course you don't know that it's misleading, right? So what I'm conjecturing, although of course that is an empirical hypothesis, is that in most cases of evidence rejection, what we have is justified and rational evidence rejection because of this kind of environmental problems. Of course, that's not to say that it's always the case. We know that there are cases of evidence resistance, like, for instance, from motivated reasoning. I'm not saying this case don't exist. All I'm saying is that they're going to be much more isolated, which makes it such that I don't need to stipulate this crazy, widely spread irrationality hypothesis. But I still need to explain what's happening in these isolated kind of cases. And what I'm saying is, look, if the proper function of our cognitive system includes proper evidential take-up. So my cognitive system is not properly functioning if there's a computer lying straight in front of me and I can't believe that there's a computer lying straight in front of me. That something went really wrong. Imagine how you would feel right now if I told you, actually, not sure there's a laptop right now in front of me. You really think that something is going wrong quite significantly. So the way in which I think about this is some of our bodily systems, as it were, are input dependent. So for instance, our lungs, if there's oxygen in the environment readily available and they don't take it up, that is a sign of malfunction. Something has gone wrong with our lungs. Similarly, I think our cognitive systems are malfunctioning if they don't take up very easily available evidence from the environment. So there's nothing strange, as it were, about our cognitive systems. Some of our systems are input dependent in that way. If they don't take up readily available inputs, they're malfunctioning. So in that sense, it is an input level type of malfunction, in that when you are this kind of system that's supposed to take up easily available something from the environment and you don't, that is one way in which you can malfunction.
So another topic that you address in the book is defeat. So what does defeat mean and how do you approach it?
So defeat is a fancy epistemological term for just evidence against something. We always like to have technical terms to pretend we're doing serious. But what is interesting about defeat, I think, in particular when it comes to this resistance to evidence phenomenon, is that it comes in two broad types of interest to us today. It's simplifying somehow the phenomenon, but that's what's important for us. There's rebutting defeat, and then there's undercutting defeat. Again, very sophisticated technical terms for actually quite simple phenomena, where rebutting defeat is evidence against a particular proposition. So the case is, you have, for instance, you have a testifier that says that it's raining outside, and you have another testifier that says it's not raining outside. So this testimony, the second testimony, is a rebutting defeater to the first one, because it's evidence against the proposition that was asserted by the first one, right? So the proposition is it's raining outside, and this is a defeater to your evidence that it's raining outside, because it says it's not raining outside, right? So the most interesting for us type of defeat, however, is not rebutting defeat that much, is undercutting defeat. So this is a very pernicious sort of situation that can lead to very widespread problems, in that this kind of defeat doesn't affect the probability of the proposition for you, but it affects the probability that your testifier is a good testifier, right? The probability that your source is a good source. So what this defeater does is it tells you your source was rubbish. So the case is one, for instance, where you have a testifier that comes and says, it's raining outside. And you have another one who comes and says, don't believe anything that George says, because George is a compulsive liar about meteorology, So the reason why this is a more dangerous form of defeat is that it doesn't only affect one proposition, it affects everything that George says from now on, right? So if this person comes and says he's a compulsive liar, you're going to be worried about everything that George says from now on, right? So it's a much more problematic form of defeat, or good form of defeat in cases in which George actually is a compulsive liar. But you can see how, in the cases of interest here, like vaccine safety and climate change, it's the difference in, as it were, danger is huge between these two types of defeaters, because it's one thing, you have your evidence from the scientists that vaccines are safe and climate change is happening. And then, you have a couple of people telling you otherwise, and you weigh these things against each other. And, the evidence in favor of the safety of vaccines and the climate change happening is hugely kind of more weighty than the three people around the world who deny these claims, right? So if that was the only problem, I don't think we would have a lot of rejection of scientific evidence, because it is overwhelming how much evidence there is that vaccines are safe and climate change is happening. Well, unfortunately, the way it works, if you look on the ground, is that these people, the people trying to deny these claims, don't come and say just vaccines are unsafe. They come and say, don't trust anything that public health authorities say about vaccines, because they have a vested interest to sell you these vaccines to make some money for the vaccine industry, or they have a vested interest to generate this kind of herd immunity. So even though they know that there are some people for which the vaccine is not safe, they're not going to tell you, because they just want to generate herd immunity. So as soon as this happens, no matter how many scientists tell you that vaccines are safe, their entire testimony is undercut, because now you don't trust any of them, and you don't trust anything that they say. You don't trust them on vaccines, you don't trust them on climate change, you don't trust them on anything anymore. So you can see how that's a much more dangerous type of defeat, and you can see it on the ground as well, because it's very pervasive, right? This is the kind of discourse that you hear. Don't trust scientists, don't trust mainstream media. Is not so the evidence, that the misleading evidence that is brought in on these policy relevant topics of high interest are very rarely actually affecting the proposition itself, vaccines are safe. So very rarely, would you see a far-right person coming and saying, actually, there's a study in Nebraska where they tested this vaccine on, people with blue eyes, and it turned out that actually it's not safe for them. No, what they come and say is usually, don't trust public health authorities, because they're just trying poison us all, and in order to whatever, give some money to the industry or something like that. So this is the kind of defeat that is mostly problematic. And what this defeat does, as I said, is it decreases your probability for the trustworthiness of the source. So that's how it becomes very problematic.
So another thing that you also address in your book is epistemic dilemma. So what is an epistemic dilemma, and why is it important for us to address it in this context of resistance to evidence?
Yeah, so there's two reasons why we need to talk about epistemic dilemmas if you write this book. One reason is purely theoretical. As soon as you postulate that there are such things as obligations in a normative domain, you might get dilemmas, right? Because permissions never generate dilemmas. If if your norm says you're permitted to jump in the lake, and this other norm says you're permitted to go to lunch, no, whether you choose to jump in the lake or go to lunch or to the country, do something altogether different, none of these norms will be breached, right? Because they just permit you, they don't ask you to do it. When you have obligations, however, if you have two that cannot be met at the same time, they come in conflict, right? The classic case is you have promised a friend to go to lunch, but you encounter a child drowning on the way. So now, evidently, you need to jump and save the child. The more obligation to save the child takes primacy, but at the same time, you will have broken your obligation to keep your promise to your friend. So, it's not a dilemmatic situation, it's just a normative conflict situation in the sense in which it's pretty clear which norm you should follow. You're not kind of like, which one should I go with? It's fairly evident you should go with saving the child. But I guess what I'm saying is that as soon as you have obligations, they might come in conflict. And when they come in conflict in a fashion where it's not really clear which one is stronger than the other, like in the case that I just described, you might be faced with a dilemma. So, as opposed to what I just described with the lunch and the child, consider a situation in which you're on your way to lunch. Now you have two children drowning, one on the left and one on the right, and you still have the promise keeping to do, right? So the promise keeping norm is completely overridden. So that's out the window. You're fine being late for lunch. But these two norms, you're still left with them. One that says save the child on the left, the other one says save the child on the right. And it seems like you're in a normative dilemma because these norms are equally strong. And no matter what you do, you're going to break a norm that's as strong as the others, right? So the question is, well, moral dilemmas, we know about them because we've studied moral obligation for 2000 years, but epistemic dilemmas, we don't know enough about them. And now that you're postulating these obligations, we gotta get them all over the place in the epistemic domain. And I guess what I'm saying is, well, first of all, no, not that much. I'm arguing in the chapter that actually epistemic dilemma are not easy to come by because what's going on in epistemology is that you can always suspend judgment. You don't need to either believe P or not P or something like that. So as soon as you have that resource, actually epistemic dilemmas are harder to come by. If anything, what is maybe easiest to come by is an epistemic trilemmas, and I give some examples in the book. But I guess going back to our phenomenon of resistance, so this is just the reason why it's theoretically interesting. But why is it practically interesting for the phenomenon, for evidence resistance? Well, because very often you hear that people say things like, I don't know what to believe anymore. Some people say vaccines are safe. Some people say they're not safe. I'm going to throw my hands in the air and not believe anything anymore. And I guess that what I'm saying is, no, actually, that situation where it's okay for you to do that, so one in which you are faced by this epistemic dilemma when it comes to believing or not believing something, is not something that occurs very often. So it's not going to be a problem. Usually when people do this, they do it unjustifiably. So it's not a phenomenon that is well spread, basically.
So I have here two more topics that I would like to ask you about. The first one is skepticism. So first of all, what does skepticism mean in this kind of context? Because I guess we could argue that there are different kinds of skeptics out there. And is it possible that at least in certain circumstances, in certain situations, skepticism is also a form of resistance to evidence?
Yeah, so I think, sometimes skepticism is warranted. So if you live in an environment in which you have a lot of evidence that P is false, skepticism about P is justified, right? And of course, this evidence may all be misleading, but even so, it's evidence, and you are supposed to, update your beliefs according to your available evidence. So it may well be that skepticism sometimes is warranted, be it about vaccines or about the existence of the external world, whether you're an epistemologist or someone who's interested in vaccine uptake. But I guess what I'm trying to argue in that chapter is that what has been assumed in the literature on skepticism in epistemology, which is that in a way, the skeptic has the safe position, because the skeptic is just sitting there, not believing anything, and wondering, why should I believe that the world exists? Because, for all I know, maybe it doesn't, and my evidence is compatible with both, and other such motivations. What I'm saying is, no, actually, you have evidence that the world exists, and you should uptake it and believe that the world exists. So what I'm basically arguing in the chapter is that this assumption that skepticism is the safe position, and it is on us non-skeptical epistemologists to explain to the skeptic why it's okay for them to, take the jump and believe that the world exists and so on, is exactly that mistaken assumption that we had about suspension, right? That it relies on the assumption that suspension is the safe position, right? As soon as we discovered that suspension of judgment is not safer than believing, that it also requires warrant, we discovered that the skeptic doesn't have anything on us, because being a skeptic also cannot be done without justification, I guess, in a nutshell.
So the last thing I would like to ask you about is, in the book you also talk about toward the end about misinformation and disinformation, which is something that people nowadays are worrying a lot about. So taking into account the main topic of the book, resistance to evidence, why do you also approach these questions surrounding misinformation and disinformation, and in what ways do you approach them?
Yeah, the reason why I think that this topic needed to be approached in this book is because these two phenomena, basically scientific evidence resistance and disinformation and misinformation, are not independent from each other. They have kind of mutually reinforcing patterns. So what's going on is, the more disinformation you have or misinformation that you have in your environment, the more misleading evidence you have, with the result that the more justified you're going to be to resist scientific evidence, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, as soon as you don't trust scientists and expertise in general anymore, you're more vulnerable to disinformation campaigns, because you don't have any expertise anymore to fall back on. So these are two phenomena that cannot be studied in isolation. And I think that the fact that they are currently studied in isolation is a big problem, and that is going to hinder progress quite a bit. So that's why I'm at the end of the book, I'm saying, look, let's look at the nature of information, misinformation and disinformation, in order to understand how these mechanisms kind of reinforce each other: scientific evidence rejection and disinformation. And one result that I get is that, again, so here's a funny thing that's happening in this literature. For the longest time, people all over the scientific spectrum who study misinformation and disinformation and their kind of flow use a dictionary definition to do that, which is really funny. I mean, especially, in domains that are otherwise quite critical, philosophy included, that you would work with the dictionary definition. I mean, if we're working with dictionary definition of knowledge or justification, we wouldn't need epistemology anymore. And the dictionary definition of disinformation, shockingly, unsurprisingly, is false. So, it's extremely anthropocentric, because it's an old definition, and it gets it wrong. So the way in which it's defined commonly is that it's kind of false content that's spread with the intention to mislead. That's roughly the definition that you find out there. And Don Fallis, my colleague Don Fallis from the US, did work a bit on this and said, well, actually, it doesn't need to be spread with the intention to mislead, because surely machines can also spread disinformation. Indeed, our worry these days is with LLMs, right? So it can just be that it's the function to mislead, not just the intention, because machines maybe don't have intentions, but they have functions. But that's about the only work that we have on disinformation. If you start working and think about it very carefully, first of all, importantly, disinformation need not be false content. And indeed, I'm a former journalist, and what we were taught in journalist school is that disinformation campaigns are not best done with false content because people are not that stupid. As I said, we're a highly successful species cognitively. The way in which you do it, if you want to have a successful disinformation campaign, is you do it with true statements that imply a falsehood, that implicate falsehood, right? So you say, you don't come and say climate change is not happening. People are going to be suspicious. You come and say something like, there is disagreement in science about climate change. Now, that is not a false statement. Of course, you can always find a couple of crazy scientists in the middle of nowhere in a village who think that climate change is not happening, right? So the statement, there is disagreement, strictly speaking, all it says is that there's at least one scientist in the world that disagrees. So the statement is true. But when you hear it on TV, what do you hear? You hear there are vast and important and relevant amounts of disagreement, because otherwise you're thinking, why is it on the news if there's only one isolated guy somewhere in the nowhere, right? So that is a pragmatic phenomenon. The sentence that you utter doesn't mean that it's a huge amount of disagreement. It just means that there is at least one person who disagrees, right? But what the hearers hear is not just what the sentence means, is also what it pragmatically conveys. And pragmatically, it conveys that it's a significant amount of disagreement. Why? Because it's told on the news. And it doesn't make for a news item if it's just one person disagreeing. So it's not relevant for the context, right? And that's how you spread disinformation cleverly, not by saying outright falsehoods. Now, the problem is that first of all, that's one thing that we don't realize when we are rushed to judgment to think that all these people rejecting scientific evidence are completely crazy and irrational. Because why would they believe when they are told by a nobody who's not a scientist that climate change is not happening? Yeah, but that's not what's happening, right? Is not that they're falling for this kind of blunt in a way, stupid way of doing disinformation. No, they're falling for the clever way of doing disinformation. And of course they are, because you're supposed to react to that pragmatic context in that way. That's the rational way to form beliefs in that context, right? So that's why it's important to have a proper definition of disinformation, because then we can see how very often people reject evidence warrantedly because of the way in which they're tricked by this kind of subtle ways of disinforming. Another reason why it's important is because we're trying to design good AIs, right? So now we have the bad AIs who are trying to spread disinformation. The good thing about that is that we can, if we're clever enough to make the bad ones, we're clever enough to do the good ones as well. So what we need to fight LLM disinformation is LLM disinformation trackers. That's what we need, because us humans are not going to be able to fight disinformation spread by LLM. But in order to build an LLM that tracks disinformation properly, you'd better know what it is, because if we just build it to track falsehoods, it's not going to track this kind of very dangerous disinformation campaigns that use this kind of pragmatic mechanisms that I mentioned earlier. So that's what I do in the chapter.
By the way, since you mentioned journalism and you also refer to the fact that you don't like the standard definition of disinformation because it implies that it has to be intentionally spread with the intent of generating false beliefs or something like that in other people, I guess that another good example of exactly that would be when sometimes on TV, for example, they do debates between a climate scientist expert and another climate scientist expert who is actually a science denier, and they present them on an equal playing field. And then, oh, we're just going to do the debate. It's for the viewers to decide. And I mean, no, it's not for the viewers.
No, so that is, I mean, I have previous work on this, that is a problem. And it's very simple to see the problem. And there is a lot of empirical literature that shows that way of doing it generates a lot of false beliefs. And I want to say rationally so, because what you're suggesting by bringing one testifier that says that P and one testifier that says that non-P, you're generating an evidential situation that's 50-50. So it's rational to be neutral under those circumstances, because the way in which these people are presented is as though they have equal evidential standing. Now, what I want to say in defense of my colleagues, the journalists, is that for the longest time, journalism is in some countries is kind of, officially regulated more than in others. But if you look at kind of deontological codes that regulate journalists, they tend to have this kind of 5 or 6 principles that should guide the activity of journalism. And the problem with these principles, more often than not, is that they include 2 principles that often contradict each other. So one principle is the reliability principle that says, do whatever you can to report the truth rather than not, right? So that's good. But then there is this kind of alleged objectivity or fairness principle where you're supposed to bring people from all corners of the debate and present them as you just suggested. And what is sometimes, and everybody thinks these 2 principles are in conflict because people think, if there's 3 positions out there, you need to bring one for each and every one of them, right? Because otherwise it's not fair. But of course, that only person A is telling the truth. So the principle of reliability tells you don't bring person B and C, just bring only person A. I think that's, it's a problem with those principles and they should be revised. But I also think that that is a bad interpretation of what the fairness or the objectivity principle should say. I think the fairness and objectivity principles should give as much exposure as the probability of being right is. So, sometimes topics are complicated, that you don't really know where the truth lies, right? So there's going to be people who argue that P is the case and people who argue that non-P is the case. And you as a journalist, you're going to have a set of evidence. And your set of evidence suggests that P is 0.7 probable and non-P is 0.3, where that's the kind of exposure that you should give if you're a truth searcher. You should give an exposure that is, that has the same weight as the evidence that you have for the truth of P, if you want to still follow the reliability principle. So I think that, in a way, all I can say about my colleagues, the journalists, is that it's not only that they're making a mistake, it's also a mistake that is warranted by the best deontological codes that we have right now, and which they need to be revised very substantively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I brought up that example also because in that particular case, at least, it doesn't seem to me that if disinformation is generated in those cases, it is intentionally done, right? I mean, I don't think that there's any journalist out there bringing on a science denier just to intentionally mislead.
No, to the contrary, and my colleagues indeed are very worried that they have to do that, and they do it because that's what the deontological code says. And I bet that whoever the fathers and mothers of this deontological code that put this deontological code together back in the day also had very good intentions. Probably they were living in a simpler epistemic environment. I would suggest, where this kind of norms would make more sense. So indeed, most of the time, this is exactly what happens. But I want to say that even with the example that I was mentioning earlier, with there's disagreement in science about climate change. Look, this pragmatic phenomena are studied in speech act theory, which is a scientific field, and which most people don't study. In particular, in journalism, nobody teaches you speech act theory that much. So the fact that these pragmatic phenomena are generated are not things that your regular journalist should be aware of. So if I come on TV and I say there's disagreement in science about climate change, when what I mean by that is that there's just one guy disagreeing, I cannot be blamed for generating the pragmatic phenomena that I just generated because I'm not aware of how these mechanisms work because I haven't studied this field. So that's why we need a bit more knowledge exchange from science towards practice, because it's not the job of the journalist to know about, Gricean pragmatics. It's the job of the scientist to come and inform the field and explain how these mechanisms work in order to make for better deontological codes for journalism.
So just to wrap things up and perhaps to just summarize this last bit about disinformation, could you tell us about then your account of disinformation as ignorance generating content? What
Yeah,
does that
so
mean exactly?
when you get rid of the dictionary definition, you're not left with much because we just got rid of the intention, we got rid of the falsehood. So what is it that we're left with?
Yeah.
So stepping back, looking at all these possible ways in which you can run a disinformation campaign, what these ways suggest is that what they all have in common is that they generate ignorance in the audience. You can do that via many ways, by saying something false or by saying something true that has a pragmatic implicature and so on and so forth. But what all these ways of generating disinformation have in common is that they have a disposition to generate ignorance in your hearer. And it's important to understand that because as soon as we understand that, we also realize that whether some content is disinformation or not is highly hearer dependent. The exact same content asserted in one context is going to generate a lot of false beliefs, asserted in another context is going to generate no false beliefs, depending on the evidential background of the audience. And indeed, we already know that disinformation campaigns are targeting particular audience groups because they know that they're particularly vulnerable in virtue of their evidential background. So just to go back to the disagreement in size about climate change, if I watch a journalist saying that, I'm not going to form the false belief that there's a huge amount of disagreement because I know how speech act theory works and I know that that journalist is just making a mistake. If that journalist comes on TV and tells my grandma the same thing, she will probably get this false belief because she's not a specialist in speech act theory. So it's important that we understand that whether a content is disinformation depends on the background evidence of the hearer, because that also explains why some people are more vulnerable to some particular disinformation messages and thereby end up rejecting scientific evidence while some people aren't. That's something that's, let me give you an example of how important it is in the real world. So Public Health Scotland, when they communicated the safety of vaccines, they just did it the same with all audiences. So they sent us all a little flyer that said, vaccines are safe, come and get them. That was all they did. Now, of course, we have very different evidential backgrounds around here in Scotland because we're very diverse people. So, for instance, the same flyer sent to white communities generated 87% or something vaccine uptake. Sent to African and Black communities generated only 40% vaccine uptake. The same message. Why? Different evidential backgrounds. The Black community has a lot of inductive evidence of discrimination from the public health authorities, which I don't. They also have a lot of background evidence of lack of trustworthiness of institutions more generally, and institutional ignorance. Again, I don't have that problem. So it is highly surprising that I trusted the flyer more than they did. So in the same way in which Public Health Scotland failed to kind of tailor their message to the evidential background of the audience, in the same way, if you want to spread this information, you can tailor your message to the audience's evidential background and target the more vulnerable communities. So that's why it's important to understand that what matters is the ignorance of the hearer rather than what is actually written on the flyer.
Mm-hmm. Great. So the book is again Resistance to Evidence. I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Simion, apart from the book, would you like to just tell people where they can find you and the rest of your work on the internet?
Yeah, so if you Google me, you're probably going to come across my my website and my university webpage, and where I have a bunch of drafts and PDFs of my papers if you're interested in more detail about my work. And the book, in good news, is open access with Cambridge due to very generous grant from the European Research Council. So if you want to read the book, you don't need to go ahead and buy it, but you can just go on the Cambridge website where you can find it open access.
Yeah, like I did. So, and I'm very grateful for that. So, Dr. Simion, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great. Thank you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbourd, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantanti, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.